Okay, let's continue and talk about consensus. So consensus is one of the very fundamental classic categories of distributed algorithms problems. And there's a huge class of consensus algorithms. It's a very much, even though it's so old, it's still a very much continuing area of important area of computer science research. And we learn new stuff about consensus all the time, let's say. Now, there's various ways consensus is formulated. In the theorists, in the computer science theory literature, you tend to see it formulated in a way that's a little bit dry and sounds a little bit unrealistic. They usually describe the problem as several processes, by which they really mean nodes in a distributed system usually, but separate processes in a distributed system propose values and have to agree on one of these values, like a number. Now, in practice, from a practical perspective, proposing a number is not it doesn't sound like a very usable, interesting consensus problem, but it's actually, kind of a trivial formal result that, if you can achieve consensus on a simple number, then you can achieve consensus on anything else. And so on a whole history, on a blockchain, if you want, it's all the same thing from a formal perspective. And so they reduce it to agreeing on a number, right? And so some processes propose numbers or values and have to agree on one of them. And the general properties we usually want from a consensus algorithm are, first of all, there might be some validity properties. Whatever the value is has to be from 1 to 5 or something. Has to be in a particular valid range. And more complex systems tend to put more complex validity predicates on this. Like, Bitcoin has, as we'll see, has a very complex validity predicate involving checking the complex semantics of a bunch of blocks containing transactions and making sure that coins aren't double spent and stuff. So this is all about constraining the validity, deciding, what values are valid values or not. So in some cases, so even though validity can be a complex predicate, actually checking validity is often the simplest part of consensus. That's just as long as you can define it as a deterministic function, you plug in any validity function you want. It takes the value, the proposed value, and returns yes or no, is it valid, right? And so from a consensus, formal consensus perspective, validity is easy. You just call a function to decide whether the value is valid, right? So then the slightly more challenging problems you have, properties you want to get, is first agreement. You want to have, these processes are going to decide, hopefully decide on some values, and agreement means no two correct, honest, correctly functioning processes should decide on different values. All correct processes should arrive at the same value, whichever one that is. Yeah.
So you said that checking validity is very easy?
Yeah.
But,
well, from a formal consensus perspective, right?
You have this network, and if you have some attackers, and they just inject some values there.
Yeah. Well.
We try not to propose. What happens then? Because we don't know exactly.
Yeah. So there's often, in practice, there's often the question, are you saying if attackers propose different valid values or invalid values?
No. So attackers are not part of the systems who actually vote, who propose.
Yeah.
But they just come, so they're outsiders. But they just, the package just gets to them, and they just change it slightly.
Yeah. Yes. So in the classic formal distributed systems consensus problem, kind of the formal take of consensus, usually there's an assumption, underlying assumption that the system is closed, and each process knows where a message arises from. There's kind of an assumption of implicit authentication, that all messages from anyone else are implicitly authenticated, and so if somebody from outside the system sent you a message, you would just know and just drop it, right? So usually, the formal consensus protocol, algorithms treat that as out of scope. That's another, that's an authentication problem, not a consensus problem. Even though in a real practical system, yeah, you had better care about authentication and how do you protect yourself from outsiders. And then when we in a little bit get into open systems like Bitcoin, where you want to allow anybody to come and to participate in the consensus process, that's another thing too. Yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah, so for the basic consensus process, we're assuming there's a closed, well-known group of participants, and the processes or these participants can authenticate each other. They know who a message is coming from, although they might not know whether it's a good message or not, right? So we want agreement. We want we want the property that no two correct processes decide on different values. We want termination. This is a liveness property, meaning eventually all of the correctly operating processes will come to this agreement. We'll decide on a value, which should be the same value based on the agreement property, right? And finally, we want an integrity property. This can also be referred to as linearizability, basically maintaining a history structure that once you've decided on any value, you never go back and revise history and decide on a different value later, right? So once you've committed, you stay committed. You never change your mind once you've agreed on something, right? So we would like all of those properties, but they tend to be surprisingly difficult to achieve together in a fully reliable, robust fashion. And there's various different security models and threat models that lead to many different types of consensus algorithms. Now, for example, in a data center, data centers are very common distributed systems these days, where consensus algorithms are very central. How many of you have heard of Apache Zookeeper? Yeah, good. So that's one of the big Apache protocol server suite that's used all over data centers, and that's one of the common open source implementations of Paxos replication, one of the classic consensus algorithms. And there's the most well-known classic consensus algorithm in this space is called Paxos, created by Leslie Lamport, and there's various reincarnations, reformulations of them. Most recently, a formulation called Raft became popular as proposed, supposedly a little easier to understand than Paxos. It's fundamentally the same thing with slight tweaks, but in a slightly more modular way that might appeal to you. Some people find it easier to understand, others don't. So, if you're interested, take a look and see if it works for you. But at any rate, the idea is, in a data center or an environment like this, you assume that you've got a number of nodes that have to agree on a state or a linearizable history, and we're going to assume that we generally assume in this context that they're fail-stop failures, that these machines might go down, but they're all under the control of one administrator. They're all, under tight security lockdown and tight deployment. They're basically all in one trust domain, So either they're all compromised together if the administrator is compromised or something, or hopefully none of them are compromised. So in this context, in the data center context, we don't usually worry about Byzantine failures. We assume that if one of them fails, it just stops and doesn't try to, it doesn't get hacked and try to maliciously trick the other ones into doing bad things, right? And so this is the context in which algorithms like Paxos and Raft are designed for. Systems where, the security model, they're all in one security domain, but they can just fail stop. And you want to make sure the system continues to achieve high availability consensus as long as not too many of them fail, right? Now, contrast this with the model where there can be Byzantine failures. So this is a situation where some of the nodes may be actively malicious. Some nodes may be hacked by a hacker, by someone who's intelligently trying to send wrong messages, who's pretending to be live and is live, but is deliberately sending wrong messages to try to trick the other nodes into doing bad things, into violating the consensus properties. And depending on the network model, in kind of the worst case adversarial network model, where you assume that the adversary controls some fraction of the participants and also controls the network timing, so that the adversary can delay some network messages, drop some network messages, control, the adversary can cause network partitions if it's in the attacker's interest, right? So in this strong adversary network model, then it's easy to prove fundamentally that that to achieve consensus, the total, you can only do that if you have a total number of nodes at least 3f plus 1, where f is the number of malicious failures you want to tolerate, right? So this means that if you want to tolerate any one malicious failures, how many nodes do you need? So for Byzantine consensus, you need 3f plus 1 nodes total. So you need 4 nodes in order to tolerate one Byzantine failure. If you're just willing to operate in the Paxos data center model, where you just assume that nodes fail quietly and without trying to trick each other, just fail stop failures, then you only need 2f plus 1 nodes total. You need 3 rather than 4 to get consensus with tolerating one failure, right? And so in the Paxos case, you can see how this works, because it's like the N version programming example that we already alluded to earlier. You have 3 versions of something. If only 2 of them are live and the other one is dead, as long as at least 2, at least a simple majority of the nodes are live and coordinating to make sure that they keep the state, then they can achieve consensus in the non-Byzantine model. But in the Byzantine model, that's not sufficient. You have to have 4 nodes. Now, in the case of Byzantine failures, if you change the network model or add other tweaks or assumptions, you can actually, there are ways you can get to the n equals 2f plus 1. For example, if you assume that the adversary can't arbitrarily delay or control the network connectivity, you say that you assume that that the honest nodes, the non-failed nodes, can also communicate with each other in a non-attacker controlled fashion, then in some cases you can get back to the 2f plus 1 case, right? But not in the arbitrary network, adversarial network case. Yeah.
I don't understand why we had plus 1 to...
Really good question. Let's look at that. So I'm glad you asked. So why do we need one more node? Why do we need 3f plus 1 rather than why the plus 1 in both the 2f plus 1 plus 3 and 3f plus 1, right? So in the Paxos case, the reason for that is fundamentally just a majoritarian principle. So if nodes go offline, so if we suppose we have two nodes and only two nodes trying to achieve consensus, but we want to tolerate one failure. One of the nodes goes offline. Well, did that? But we don't know whether the one node that's still online doesn't necessarily know whether the other node is crashed, has failed completely, or is just split from the network. The network is the other node down, or is the network down between them, right? So it's generally impossible to distinguish, node failures from network partitions, right? So if we tried to have a consensus algorithm, with just two nodes tolerating one failure, then the one remaining node wouldn't be able to tell whether the other node is also continuing to make progress on its side of the failure, making different inconsistent decisions, right, which would violate consensus, because we can't tell the difference between a partition and a failure. But if we have three nodes and we have one failure, then as long as two nodes are on one side of the partition, as long as we enforce a majority requirement, that if there is, then we get a guarantee that only one side of the partition can possibly have a majority of the nodes, and that side can still continue to make progress without risking integrity. You can't have two partitions with a strict majority of nodes on both sides, right? Just counting, right? So, similarly, if you want to tolerate two failures, you fundamentally have to have 5 nodes. You have to have majorities of 3 in order to ensure that there can never be a partition network with 3 nodes on one side and 3 nodes on the other that make progress leading to inconsistent results independently. You can have 3 on one side and 2 on the other, and one side making progress, or you can split it in worse ways so that 2 nodes, and 1 node in 3 separate partitions. Then everybody's going to be dead, and you're at least protecting consistency even though the system is no longer available, right? Yeah, so good question. That's why we always need the +1 in general. But why the deeper, more subtle question, why do we need 3f plus 1 rather than 2f plus 1 in the Byzantine case, right? And so this is not quite as trivial to show or to explain, but I hope this gives you an intuitive idea. So let's say you have you have only 3f nodes, we have 3 nodes and we're trying to achieve Byzantine fault tolerance, which won't work. But so we assume one of those 3 nodes is malicious and is trying to violate consensus, actively trying to do evil things. And that malicious node is also colluding with an adversary that controls the network and can split the network however the adversary wants, right? So what the adversary can do is to divide the network into 3 groups. They call them P, Q, and R. So P is the node or nodes that are corrupted, the 1/3 of the nodes that are adversarial. Q are honest nodes. R is one group of honest nodes, and R is another group of honest nodes, but the attacker prevents the honest nodes Q and R from talking to each other. It's a split brain. The Q nodes and the R nodes are all honest, but they can't talk to each other. They're split brains. They're schizophrenic. Now, if we allowed merely 2/3 majority to make decisions and make progress, then the attacker, the attacker P wearing one hat could make consensus, could work with the honest nodes queue to make progress in one universe, in one virtual, timeline. And then that attacker could wear a different hat, change hats, work with the other group of honest nodes R to make progress. It has another different, 2/3 majority there, and make progress on a different timeline, and basically equivocate, play two games at once, create two different histories at once, which completely violates the integrity property that we're trying to achieve, right? And so, kind of convince the consensus system to create multiple inconsistent histories, despite the honest nodes Q and the honest nodes R all behaving exactly like they should, right? And so this is fundamentally because the attacker, we assume here in this strong attack model that the attacker can corrupt 1/3 of the nodes and can divide, can prevent some of the honest nodes from communicating with each other, right? Okay, is that clear? So it's important to understand some of those fundamental principles. Of course, we could go a lot deeper in consensus algorithms and other courses you can take here, like the distributed algorithms courses and stuff would definitely go a lot deeper into that. But hopefully that gives you a sense for some of the fundamental principles of consensus algorithms. And so with that, let's take a look at some of the recent developments related to consensus, such as Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Now, of course, Bitcoin is a very interesting, relatively recent phenomenon. Basically, the first deployed, successful, fully decentralized electronic currency, which basically started from nothing in terms of value and usage back a few years ago, and then exploded, and then the value has been all over the case since then. And the basic idea. What Bitcoin does is it takes a distributed system, mixes in some clever use of cryptography, public key and symmetric key crypto, and lots of energy, and produces this currency we think of as Bitcoin. And the whole idea is to use this distributed group of nodes, widely distributed, with in principle open to anyone to participate, and rely on that distributed group of nodes instead of any central party such as a traditional bank, right? And so actually being the first working, reasonably secure system to achieve that idea, and that was an old idea that had been tried before in prior systems in various forms without success. Actually, successfully doing this was a really huge, groundbreaking achievement that Bitcoin made. It's it's really super interesting and innovative in the systems sense. How even though all of the pieces that Bitcoin put together were old news, old distributed systems concepts, the way it put them together into the system was really impressive and interesting. So how does Bitcoin work? Now, fundamentally, Bitcoin is a consensus protocol. It's a kind of a weird, somewhat novel consensus protocol that throws away some of the classic assumptions and requirements that traditional distributed systems people imposed on consensus protocols. But it's basically doing consensus. And the idea is that Bitcoin, the currency operates by keeping a log of all the transactions that everybody ever does, and keeping basically a public log of who owns what. The who just mean identifying users and accounts via a public key that can be used for signing. And whenever anybody wants to propose a transaction, they just say, Alice wants to pay money to Bob. All Alice does is she just signs a transaction saying that, saying here, I hereby sign this amount of Bitcoin over to Bob, signs it with Alice's public key. So it basically just uses public key signatures, and then Alice creates this transaction and broadcasts it through the distributed network, right? And so in principle, if that just happens, then hopefully everybody can see that transaction. But is it committed, right? Is it definite? That's the real consensus question. Yeah.
Does she sign it with the public or the private?
Well, she signs it with her private key. Then anybody can verify it with her public key. Yeah. Sorry if I misspoke there. So yeah. So this is how a normal transaction is supposed to work in the good case. But what if one of the key problems is the double spending problem? Alice could, in one part of the network, sign a transaction saying, I'm paying this Bitcoin to Bob, but then also send to a different node somewhere else in the network a competing transaction saying, I'm paying this same Bitcoin, double spending it, paying it to Charlie, right? And what happens in this case? Well, both of these transactions are going to propagate throughout the network at different rates. We don't know, does one of them might win in terms of prevalence or not, but if these nodes just try to apply whichever correctly signed Alice transaction appears first, then they're going to come to a disagreement. They're going to come to a state where some nodes thinks that Bob now owns this Bitcoin. Other nodes are going to say that Charlie owns this Bitcoin, and well, see, we have a consensus problem. Then we have to resolve this to figure out one state of the universe. Maybe we don't care that much which of these transactions wins, but one of them had better win, and everybody had better come to agreement on which of them wins, right? And so now this yellow node in the middle has several neighbors that disagree on what the state of the network is, and how do we resolve that, right? And so Bitcoin has a conflict resolution algorithm that eventually ensures that the whole network comes to agree that either the yellow nodes or the blue nodes, the blue transactions win. So this is where, in order to achieve this, generally most consensus algorithms need a leader of some kind. And Paxos is the classic consensus algorithms like Paxos and Byzantine fault tolerance algorithms most often use leaders, and Bitcoin uses leaders too. So then a leader is just somebody that proposes a value. Now the leader doesn't have power. The leader has to go around and convince everybody to sign on with his proposal. But the point is the leader takes the initiative and proposes some value. And in Bitcoin, the leader is known as a miner. And miners are just temporary leaders, right? So a miner is any node who cares to try to formulate a block of transactions. A miner sits on the network, collects proposed transactions from Alice and Bob, and anybody who wants to propose transactions, collects a bunch of transactions into a block, adds a nonce. That's just a value that starts at 0 or 1 and increments. And so the leader creates this proposed block that supposedly satisfies the validity criteria for Bitcoin blocks, and then hashes it with the nonce set to 0. That cryptographic hash comes out to something, and that something probably won't be good enough because it has no 0 bits at the beginning. And so the miner will change the nonce and try again, get a different hash, because the nonce has changed, the hash will come out differently. And does that have any 0 bits? No. Well, we'll keep trying, and we'll keep trying and trying and trying until we find a nonce that produces a block with a certain number of 0 bits at the beginning. And that's the work factor. That's the hardness. That's a parameter. At any given time, the miners have to add a block, the miners have to find a block with a nonce value that hashes to something with a given number of 0 bits at the beginning, right? And why do we call this a proof of work? Well, we call that because once the miner does find this block, he can just broadcast it, say, hey everyone, look at this block I found. And anybody who's trying to verify that that's a good block, can just hash it and observe that, there are 16 0 bits in front at the beginning of that hash. Therefore, because I believe that that's a good cryptographic hash, and as far as I know, nobody's broken SHA-256 yet, that means that in order to find that, you must have done about 2 to the 15th tries in order to find that block. You must have, the only way we know to find something like this with a strong cryptographic hash function is brute force search. So you must have done a brute force search through at least, on average 2 to the 15th tries to find that, right? So it's just statistics, right? So, but anybody trying to verify this does not have to do 2 to the 15th operations. It just has to do one SHA-256 operation and observe. Indeed, the hash comes out that way. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Why are we bothering with this? Why are we making miners do all this work, right? And so that's what brings us back to the, how this fits into the consensus algorithm. So the fundamental purpose is to rate limit the creation of blocks. So the idea is everybody is going to be trying to create blocks all the time, but we want to slow it down. We want to make sure that regardless of the number of participants trying to create blocks, they don't do it too fast. And if we don't add any barrier to them doing it, then they'll just do it really fast and create a lot of blocks, and it'll be complete chaos because the blocks won't create a clean history. So we want a process in which some miner creates a block, and then all of the miners work for a while, think for a while, add some delay so that with a reasonable probability, by the time somebody creates the next block, most likely that will be the only person who has a block at about that time, and others will be able to hear about that block. This block will be announced through the network, and most of the network will learn about the new block before somebody else finds a new block, and then they can kind of continue adding to this chain in a kind of paced and consistent fashion. So it's important, the fundamental purpose is to rate limit the creation of new blocks so that each new block usually can get announced throughout the network before and other people start building on the new block before some competing block turns up, right? But this is a statistical property. So sometimes just based on chance, and this happens fairly often in Bitcoin, two miners happen to get blocks, to find new blocks at about the same time. But each of them finds a new block before it's learned of the other block. This is just, kind of asynchronous, a race condition, right? And of course, they can, if they're malicious, they can make this happen deliberately. They can create blocks behind the scenes without announcing them, and this leads to a category of attack called selfish mining attacks, which is a very interesting topic that I don't really have time to get into. But even in the normal case, we have to have a conflict resolution mechanism. And the way Bitcoin does this is it says, okay, sometimes this happens. There will be two versions of history, but, and then in this case, some part of the network, some part of the mining network will be trying to extend the blue version of the blockchain, and some other part of the network will be trying to extend the yellow version of the blockchain. We're not sure what the distribution will be, but pretty soon, statistically, one of them will win. Some miner will extend one of those chains, and with some reasonable probability, that'll happen well before somebody extends the other chain. So with fairly high probability, And then when that happens, when anybody extends either of those chains and announces that block, then the new strictly longest chain, embodying the most work, basically wins globally. So, the evidence of that new block that extends the chain, everybody, at least all the honest miners, take that as evidence. Well, this version of history won. We can now go back and forget that blue block because it's strictly less interesting. It represents strictly less work than this version of history, and so it statistically ensures that with very high probability the network converges on one version of history after a small number of blocks. Yeah.
Can you repeat again why those having like different lengths? So the one, yeah, exactly.
So these have the same length at the moment. They're the same amount of work. So in this case, the miners who see both of those blocks will probably just take the first one that they see, right? And they, at this state, the miners don't have any evidence that one of them is better than the other, so they'll probably just take the first one they see and reject the other one, try to work on, and so that's why I said some of the miners will try to further extend the blue block, some of the miners will try to extend the yellow block. We don't know which of those subgroups is going to be successful first, but they're basically involved in a race. And likely one of them will win before the other. So just again, statistic. So there's always, at each stage, there's always some chance that, so we had a moderately low probability event here that two miners mined blocks at almost the same time. We might have a second low probability event that two different miners on these two chains also mine blocks almost at the same time and don't succeed in resolving this conflict. And that could happen again and again and again. But you can see, it becomes exponentially unlikely as, this scenario is to continue as the number of blocks increase, right? So basically, because of that exponential decay in the likelihood of forks persisting, we can guarantee with high probability after a small number of blocks, like 5 or 6 is the rule of thumb, you can assume that, well, if a transaction is buried 6 deep, then it's exponentially unlikely that the chain will be reorganized. Yeah.
And why do we take the longest one? Is it
It's technically not the longest one. It's the one with the most work, and that's a subtlety that comes into play because the amount of work needed to add blocks actually changes over time. It's a self-adjusting process that ensures that if nodes are adding, if people are bringing more mining hardware, and creating blocks too quickly, then the system they all agree to increase the work hardness, cause everybody to work more, to slow it back down, basically to target an average of about 10 blocks per block every 10 minutes. So
that's why we need actually the majority of honest users, right? Because
yes, exactly.
the majority just works towards the same direction, kind of like they're going to be faster, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that basically creates, the majoritarian, this has fundamentally a majoritarian honesty principle inherent in it, in that if a majority is dishonest, or wants to do something else, wants to rewrite history, then if you have a majority of hash power, then any majority can create a blockchain, a competing blockchain, perhaps out of sight, hidden, faster than the honest minority, and then can say, okay, you thought you had created this history, but look, we have a much longer, bigger, better history with more work. Bingo! Here we've just rewritten history for you, right? So, but the security premise is that when it's working correctly, the majority will not be colluding in that way, and so as long as the majority of hash power is behaving relatively honestly, no minority will be able to create a blockchain as fast as the honest majority is extending it, right? Yeah.
I want to be clear of the procedure. So the miner who is broadcasting this
Well, all of the miners and all of the other full nodes are always just gossiping, distributing the latest good block they've seen with the most work involved, basically. So, yeah. So whatever whatever the current state of the universe, all of the nodes are going to be just constantly looking for the next, longer, more work block. And whenever they see one, they're just going to say, "Hey, everybody, I found a new block. Let me share it with you." And so that's just basically a gossip network. Make sense? Yeah. Okay. So that's the statistical way that Bitcoin resolves forks. Of course, so like I mentioned, if there was a dishonest minority that could actually create new blocks at a faster rate than the honest minority, then that dishonest majority could actually rewrite the blockchain by creating a longer, more work blockchain in the past, and then presenting it, say, here we go, right? But Bitcoin's security model assumes that won't happen. Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah.
Or,
The whole reasoning behind slowing down this creation of new blocks.
yeah.
A Bitcoin specific, the blockchain work.
Yeah, that's specific to Bitcoin's consensus algorithm, Bitcoin's somewhat weird consensus algorithm, which has come to be called Nakamoto consensus after the pseudonymous creator of Bitcoin. We don't know who Satoshi Nakamoto is, but, well, now he has a consensus algorithm named for him. So.
And the only reasoning behind it is really to slow it down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, so if you analyze the way this would work, if new valid blocks get proposed too fast, then everybody drowns in block soup, and there's no really, basis to decide that any one history is better than any other, right? And there's been, especially out of a colleague that recently graduated from ETH Zurich, did some nice analysis. If you decrease the 10 minutes, now you can decrease the 10 minutes by that's quite a generous boundary, and like Ethereum uses a much shorter timeout. But if you decrease it too much, then you start getting more and more prevalent competing blocks. And when that happens, you're effectively wasting effort, and you're reducing the security and reducing the fairness in various ways. Various bad things start gradually happening, and then, if you really reduced it too much so that there's just all kinds, a lot of blocks available all the time, then most of those blocks will be wasted effort on behalf of everyone, and you'll have, no predictability of, which of these many competing versions of history is eventually going to win, right? Yeah. So that's a good question. So in Bitcoin, the Bitcoin network doesn't enforce any specific decision predicate. How do you tell when your transaction has been accepted, when you've been paid? Well, you judge that in principle, and that's a client specific judgment. And if you've heard of zero confirmation transactions, that basically means you've submitted your transaction, assuming and hoping some miner will pick it up and including in a block, but you're not waiting around for that to happen. So in principle, you could be vulnerable to double spending attacks. But nevertheless, people sometimes do use zero confirmation transactions. But like if you have a one confirmation client, then you're just waiting for it to appear in one block, which is not very secure, because the one block at the head that your transaction appeared in could get rewritten, by an innocent fork or by a malicious activity, right? So the suggested predicate in the Bitcoin paper is wait for 6 blocks. Make sure your transaction has appeared in a block and 6 more blocks have appeared after it. Then it's pretty unlikely, hopefully, that somebody would be able to either accidentally or maliciously rewrite 6 or more blocks of the blockchain, right?
But this actually takes a lot of time, right? So
yeah.
creating
It takes an hour. That's why if you want to receive money securely on Bitcoin and be sure from a decentralized sense that you have actually received that money, it takes an hour.
So if I actually want to buy
or more. What?
so
Yeah, Bitcoin is not very good for buying coffee. Yeah, and especially not good for buying pizza. Even it's ironic because the very first commercial Bitcoin transaction was to buy a pizza, but buying pizza is precisely not what Bitcoin is good for, because the pizza is going to be cold by the time you're sure you got the money, right? So yeah, Bitcoin, is a very interesting algorithm. It has its strengths, it has its weaknesses. It scales. It has this openness, which is cool and different from classic consensus algorithms. It's also, in case you looked at this and thought through it, it's also robust to network partitions in that it will keep going. It picks availability over consistency. If you partition a Bitcoin network, the two subsets will keep mining, but then one of the subsets is probably going to have more hash power than the other, and so when the partition heals and they come back together, everybody who is on the weaker partition is going to be disappointed because their history is going to suddenly get rewritten. All their transactions, poof, yeah, sorry for your loss, kind of thing, right? And if an attacker can arrange such a network partition, then there's all kinds of bad things the attacker can do. Yeah. Yeah.
what to do with double spending? Because
Yeah. So that comes back to that depends on both the consensus working and the validity. So the way that the blockchain, the transactions are validated ensures that as long as everybody agrees on a single history, then it's just a deterministic function. All the nodes have to check the structural consistency of the blockchain to ensure that that at any given time a single Bitcoin has only one owner, one well-defined owner. Yeah. So everybody's still checking like a fairly complex validity predicate, but because the consensus is working, that becomes just a straightforward deterministic function. I'm just checking that anybody formulated the block according to the correct rules, and then that eliminates double spending. Okay, yeah. So I'm glad this was an interesting topic. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Maybe I might be able to continue a little bit in a subsequent lecture. I'll have to be away next week, and Linus will fill in again next week. Maybe he can continue this a little bit, or I can in 2 weeks after I get back and talk a little bit more about Bitcoin and crypto and smart contracts if we have time. But okay, thanks. So I'll see you in 2 weeks, but be here in 1. Yeah.